GoForThe2.com in with the Week 1 predictions for the college football season. If you watched Fantasy Sports Radio Network, I was 2-2 for the first week of the year, but the real season kicks off this Thursday night, straight through Labor Day night. Marquee battles, front and center stage. Let's get right into it. Classic Big Ten battle, Ohio State, Indiana. Buckeyes have dominated the series, have won 22 straight games by an average margin of victory of 20.6 points per game. Last loss came by Ohio State in 1988 by the Hoosiers, so they haven't won in almost 30 years in this battle, but I like Indiana's chances week number 1. Ohio State loses 19 of the team's 26 receiving touchdowns, with Wilson, Samuel, and Noah Brown all moving on to the NFL. Could put a lot of pressure on an inconsistent quarterback in J.T. Barrett, especially at the end of the season, to make plays vertically against Indiana's secondary. I think when you look at the defensive losses, leading tackler Raekwon McMillan, he had 102 total tackles, moves on to the NFL, but 3 starters now for the Buckeyes in that secondary. Lattimore, Conley, and Hooker are all gone, and that's the concern I have for Ohio State in this matchup. They're going up against a senior experienced quarterback in Richard Lago with 2 experienced wide receivers in Nick Westbrook and Simi Cobbs that can put pressure on Ohio State's secondary vertically. Simi Cobbs might not play, but I expect him to play. Had some off-the-field issues in July. No word yet, but even if he doesn't play, there's experience at the wide receiver position for Indiana in this matchup. When you look at the secondary for Ohio State, when you're starting 3 new starters, they have to understand coverage, they have to understand formations, and more importantly, have to communicate as a unit in terms of reading coverages. And I think that's where breakdowns can occur. Could take a couple of games. Sometimes it could take a whole season in terms of working as a unit, in terms of continuity. And that's why I like Indiana in this Week 1 matchup. Expect the crowd to be up and into this ball game. And also, look at Ohio State's second game on the year in Columbus, coming up against Oklahoma and Baker Mayfield. Even though it's a Big Ten battle, they've dominated Indiana in recent years. Could they be looking ahead to the Sooners in week number 2? That can be a concern of mine. I like Indiana to strike the upset 31-24. Indiana wins over Urban Meyer and the crew. Let's stay in the Big Ten SEC battle. It's a rematch of the bowl game a couple of years ago. Jim Harbaugh and Michigan dominated that matchup 41-7. You look at the concerns offensively for Michigan. De'Veon Smith, their leading rushers, gone. Chesow and Darboh, their wide receivers, are gone. Tight end Jake Buck, gone. But you look at the defensive losses for Michigan. They lose 33 of the team's 46 total sacks from last year. That's 71% of the sack production has moved on to the NFL. In 2016, Michigan held 8 of 13 opponents under 100 yards rushing. They were 8-0 in those ball games and won those games by 37 points per game. Their 3 losses to Iowa, Ohio State, and Florida State, they allowed over 100 yards rushing to each of those opponents. So that's the matchup you want to see play out in this ballgame. When you look at Florida's rushing attack, they struggled last year. They only had 128 rushing yards on the ground and did not have a rushing touchdown in the last 6 games of the year. Jim McElwain is going with a 3-quarterback system: Malik Zaire, Felipe Franks, and Luke Del Rio. But I think Luke Del Rio is healthy. If he's healthy, he'll play a majority of the time in this matchup. I think he gives the Gators the best chance to win in this ballgame. Defensively is where I like Florida. They're able to run sideline to sideline from a speed perspective. And you look at the secondary last year. They held all 13 opponents under 58% completion percentage, and they held 7 of 13 under 50% completion percentage. Going up against an inexperienced offense in Michigan, even though they have Wilton Spate, I like Florida in this matchup. I think the speed is the difference, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I like Florida to strike the upset 23-17 over Michigan in this battle. Another reason why is Jabril Peppers, their outside linebacker, has moved on to the NFL. That's why Michigan was so dominant in run support. His ability at the line of scrimmage to put pressure on opposing offensive lines really forced opposing offensive lines to account for him in terms of a blocking scheme at all times. With his departure, it's going to put a lot of pressure on Michigan's front seven to step up in this ball game. I like the physicality of Florida in this game. 23-17, Florida strikes the upset. Another battle, South Carolina, North Carolina State. I'm very high in North Carolina State this year. Picked them at 9-3. I like their quarterback, Ryan Finley. 18 touchdowns, 8 interceptions last year. Has a big play wide receiver slash H-back in Jalen Samuels that did have 7 receiving touchdowns in 2016. They utilize him in the slot, the tight end position. He also could be utilized on fly sweeps and reverses from an offensive scheme. I think that gives NC State balance entering this matchup. You look at South Carolina. They were 6-7 last year. The only team they beat with a winning record was the University of Tennessee. They beat them 24-21 in Columbia. They have a big play quarterback in Bentley, and I like Rico Dowdle, but I think the defensive concerns are glaring for Will Muschamp and this crew. They allowed around 223 rushing yards per game. They do get their leading tackler from 2 years ago, Sky Moore. He comes back for this season, but he's coming off an ACL injury. I don't think he'll make that much of a difference. You look at the defensive front seven for NC State. Bradley Chubb is an NFL star in the making. He's a big body, goes about 6'4", 280 pounds. He was a dominant force in terms of tackles for losses last year, and more importantly, this front seven only allowed 108 rushing yards per game to opposing offenses. They played Clemson very close in Death Valley. They lost that game by 7 points in overtime. Also pushed Florida State to the limit, losing that matchup in Raleigh, 24-20. I like what Dave Dorian has done here. I like NC State as a whole, and I like their speed on the perimeter, not just on the offensive side of the ball, but on the defensive side of the ball. And I think NC State wins this game convincingly. 38-21, NC State rolls in this matchup. I want to turn our attention to Monday night. It's a marquee battle, Tennessee, Georgia Tech. Not high on Tennessee either entering 2017. I picked this team right at 6-6 overall. Some concerns on the defensive front seven. They lose Derek Barnett. They lose Jalen Reeves-Mabe. And this was a defense that allowed 218 rushing yards per game to opposing offenses last year. They allowed 4 of 13 opponents to rush for over 300. They allowed 353 rushing yards to Texas A&M, 409 to Alabama, 443 to Kentucky, and 420 to Missouri. They cannot win ball games when you can't shut down the run consistently, and they're going up against the triple option, which is a very difficult matchup. Week number 1, the triple option is a lot different in game speed than it is in practice situations, and you need big physical defensive tackles that can disrupt the timing of that offense. I know leading rusher Dedrick Mills is out for this ball game. He's kicked off the team for Georgia Tech. But to me, it doesn't matter. It's a scheme. It's a plug-and-play type of system. You can look at Navy last year when they were on their third-string quarterback and were still able to produce points in that scheme because of the zone blocking for the offensive line. I think that's the difference. You're also talking about a Georgia Tech team that was 3-0 against the SEC in 2016. They dominated Vanderbilt early on in the year. They came from behind against arch rival Georgia, and they dominated Kentucky in the bowl game. To me, that's the difference. I like Georgia Tech in this battle. They're underdogs. They're also in Atlanta. I think they strike the upset convincingly. I think they win this ball game by 13 points. Georgia Tech 33, Tennessee 20. Just not sold on what Butch Jones and the crew have done there. Entering 2017, I think they underachieved in 2016. I think when you look at this matchup over the weekend, here's another game I'm keeping an eye out. Louisville and Purdue. A lot of people are high on Purdue. With new head coach Jeff Brom, I think he's the right guy for the job. Has a big play quarterback in David Blau, 25 touchdowns, 21 interceptions. This was a team in Purdue that was negative 17 in turnover margin, one of the worst offensive and defensive units in college football last year, one of the worst, dead last in FBS in turnover margin, minus 17. That's a cause of concern entering the 2017 season. Another cause of concern is the rushing attack. They only had averaged 96 rushing yards per game last year as an offensive unit. They became one-dimensional, put a lot of pressure on the offensive line, and more importantly, put Purdue into third down and long situations, and that's where David Blau struggled as a quarterback in terms of turnovers. I think when you look at the defense, this defense is slow, and they struggled in run support last year. They allowed 238 rushing yards to opposing offenses. They're going up against Lamar Jackson and Louisville. Although Louisville misses their top 3 leading wide receivers from last year, Lamar Jackson is the difference in this matchup. His speed on the perimeter is going to put a lot of pressure on Purdue to run sideline to sideline. They haven't seen a quarterback like him in the Big Ten. I think this is a bad matchup from a speed perspective for Purdue. I think Louisville dominates this ball game. I don't even think it's close. Even though the game is in Indianapolis, so you would expect a home field for Purdue, I think they get blown out 56-20 by Lamar Jackson. I think the speed of Louisville on the outside is the concern that I have for Purdue in this matchup. I think once Louisville jumps up early, it'll be lights out, and the Cardinals dominate this ball game 56-20. Another ball game I'm keeping an eye out on, I've been very high on this team, is Northwestern. I like Northwestern to win their half of the Big Ten this year. I love Clayton Thorson. I love Justin Jackson. A couple of factors why I like this team. They can play an up-tempo attack like they did last year on the road against Michigan State in East Lansing and on the road against Iowa. They played very well on the road last year. They lost to Ohio State by 4 points, or they could play a slow ball control type of attack like they did against Pittsburgh in the Pinstripe Bowl. I think when you look at this matchup against Nevada, Nevada loses their leading rusher, James Butler, that has moved on as a graduate transfer to Iowa. He led that team with over 1,300 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns. You're talking about a Nevada team last year that was 5-7 overall, but 4 wins against FBS opponents came with a combined overall record of 10-38, or a 208 winning percentage. They didn't beat good teams for the 5 wins on their resume, and they're going up against one of the most physical offensive blue-collar teams in Northwestern. I really like this team, and I think they dominate this matchup. Week number 1 in Evanston. I think new head coach Jay Norville, too, will be experimenting in this battle. Pat Fitzgerald always seems to have his teams ready week number 1, and I like Northwestern to dominate this matchup. I think they win this ball game by 35 points or more. I really feel that they are one of the best teams in the Big Ten. I picked them and Penn State to go to the Big Ten championship. I'm not backing down. Northwestern wins this game convincingly at home in Ryan Field by 35 points or more against the Wolfpack. Another game I'm keeping an eye out on is Auburn, Georgia Southern. A lot of people love Jarrett Stidham, think Auburn's going to be the predecessor in terms of knocking off Alabama, in terms of challenging Alabama for the SEC West title. You're looking at an Auburn team that was 8-5 last year. They averaged 271 rushing yards per game. Cam Petaway, Kerryon Johnson. They tried this experiment 2 years ago. They also have with Jeremy Johnson and have a new offensive coordinator in Chip Lindsey. It's a lot of moving parts. I think Jarrett Stidham is a system quarterback. And more importantly, you look at the defensive side of the ball. They lose 12.5 of the team's 25 total sacks with the loss of Montravius Adams and Carl Lawson moving on to the NFL. This was a defensive secondary that in the first 7 games of the year allowed 198 passing yards to opposing offenses. Auburn was 5-2 in those ball games. Over the last 6 games of the year, they were 3-3 and allowed 265 passing yards to opposing offenses. Georgia Southern's a team, especially with the triple option attack, that if they score early on can slow this ball game down and get Auburn into a methodical, low-scoring game and be in striking distance from start to finish. Auburn does play Clemson week number 2. They're not going to want to show a lot in this ball game with a new quarterback in Jarrett Stidham and a new offensive coordinator. I'm going with the huge underdog here. I think Auburn wins this ball game, but I think it is very, very, very close. I think this game is anywhere 27-17. I think Auburn wins but it is a lot closer than people think. Auburn squeaks by Georgia Southern. We're just getting started. You can catch all of the marquee battles up on College Football Today Live. That's live on Dish Network this coming Saturday, 9 to 12 Eastern, 6 to 9 Pacific in the morning, channel 266 Dish Network or Fantasy Sports Television Network or Radio Network. We'll be going down all the marquee games. You'll hear all of my other picks on the show. Have a great weekend, everyone. Can't wait for the season to start. Stay with me all season long.